Salisbury, North Carolina is not a tiny town, but it's small. Small enough where we could run around and do what we wanted and not have to worry about anything. We had only been out of school one full week. It was a Friday, and it was a beautiful day. Hot day in the South.
For Jody Trexler and her big sister Risa, summer vacation is just getting started. Jody, who's 13, will start high school in the fall. 15-year-old Risa will be a junior.
Risa was maturing more into a teenager and just making new friends at high school. She and I had started kind of dividing. She didn't share everything with me as much as she had before. That day, Risa had a couple friends over.
Risa and I were in the same grade together, and we lived about a half a mile from each other. Risa had cable. We didn't have cable at my house. We were hanging out, watching MTV, which was very exciting at the time. That was new then.
Paul was the cool guy from California, had the long hair, skateboarder, punk rock, the type of guy that nobody in this southern town had the balls to be. Jim, he was the clown. He was very funny. I think he always had a little secret crush on Risa, but I think he knew that that was something that could never be.
It was just a regular day. It was comedy of the older sister and the younger sister, like, leave us alone. We're grown-ups watching TV, having fun. I can actually see Risa in the big chair, kind of balled up with the remote, just running things. We hung out a lot, and Risa was just a great friend and loved everyone. And she was so alive and fun and wonderful.
She was the more good-natured person between the two of us. Her side of the bedroom was always the neat side. She always had her bed made, everything stacked up perfect. My side of our room was a mess. She wasn't as wild as I was as a kid. Probably a little typical sibling jealousy. She was the older sister. She was cool. She was pretty. And sure, I'd get a little jealous if she got to do stuff that I couldn't do. But nothing out of your ordinary, typical sisters. We were very close. One of my favorite memories of Risa to this day is watching thunderstorms. At night, when storms would come, we would cut the lights off and lay in our beds or lay on the floor and watch the storms through the window, the lightning and the thunder.
Salisbury was the type of place where everyone knew everyone. The doors were left open.
It's a quaint community, very much a church-going sort of community with very active social clubs. Big parade every year at Christmas that still goes on to this day.
Most towns in America have an economic divide. But back in the 1980s, there was an especially big gap between Salisbury's haves and the have-nots.
Salisbury was known for being the home of one of the largest grocery store chains in the country. And there were a lot of folks, particularly in the 80s, that made millions of dollars on the stock from that grocery store chain. And that's what Salisbury was known for.
But my family and Jody's family, we lived on the wrong side of the tracks. Very poor neighborhood.
This is the house that Risa and I grew up in. You can't see it from here, but our bedroom was on the end of this side of the house. It's covered up by the trees and shrubs now. And the whole block down to the stop sign was family. Our grandparents lived right next door. We were there many times a day, back and forth, always playing in the yard. All of this was not here when we were growing up. It was just a clear yard. It's a totally different place now.
We were all sitting in the living room, just laughing, watching TV. At around 3 o'clock, Risa was like, my soaps are coming on. So Jim and I are like, we don't want to watch soaps. And I had to get to my job at a fast food restaurant I was working at. So we headed out.
And then we were at home by ourselves.
At some point, Jody realizes that her sister Risa has left the home, presumably going just next door as she often did.
I decided to walk over, and I walked about halfway, about right past this crepe myrtle tree, and then I realized both the cars were gone. Their front door was closed, so I turned around and walked back home.
Jody assumes that her sister ran an errand with her grandparents and thinks no more of it.
It had only been maybe a couple hours from the time our friends left. I was in my room listening to the radio. I think I talked to a couple friends on the telephone. Where I sat on my bed from that window, I could see my grandparents' house entirely. And that was when I saw my grandfather come running out of the house, screaming. So I ran over there, and I ran into the house, into the living room first, and I didn't see anything. I was just looking around everywhere. I still had no idea what was going on. And when I turned a corner and saw into the spare bedroom, it was bloody. It was a mess. My sister was mostly covered by a blanket, so I could see her hair and part of her face. I remember having to beg a police officer to tell me if she was dead or not. I was in more or less in some kind of trance.
When I got back to the house, I saw my father standing out on the front porch, and he was screaming. And I just jumped out of the car. I was thinking it was my mother, something that happened to my mother. For some reason, I remember being on my hands and knees. I don't know how I got on my hands and knees, but I remember crawling up to her body. Then I saw Risa's body laying there. Just horror. Horror. I still have flashbacks. Her eyes were open. She looked just like a little China doll. And I knew by looking at her eyes that she was gone. I just lost it, got hysterical, and just ran out of the house. I just ran and ran. My brother pulled up beside me in his pickup truck. Then he took me home. When I got back, my house was already full of people, police cars everywhere.
The call came in, and I responded to it. I walked in there, and I was just horrified. She was on the floor, fully nude. Multiple stab wounds to her body. There was a stab wound next to the neck, and that blade was inside her shoulder, left inside. We found some semen on her right leg. It was highly likely that she'd been assaulted. The thing I remember most about this case is seeing a young 15-year-old had a full life and someone to go and brutally kill her and left her like she's a piece of wood. A police officer is going to be tough, you know. It doesn't let him bother him, you know. And that's not true. I just can't comprehend me driving to my house, and my daughters are at home, and one of them has been murdered. Can you imagine that? No. No way. I mean, that's devastating.
It's just like this big void, just like an empty pit in your stomach. Just a hollowed out place. It's just open, raw.
It's hard to explain. how it feels to have everything change so drastically, so fast. At that time, I just couldn't understand it.
I'll always remember Risa as just a force, a life, like her huge smile and sparkle in her eyes. I can just see the hazel eyes and the big grill grin. I'll just always remember her smile and eyes.
I was scared, paranoid, suicidal. I lay awake at night just wondering, thinking over everything, everybody, every possibility. I kept thinking it must be a transient or something from somewhere that did it. That's all that went through my mind. I never thought about anybody she knew.
I knew that someone had killed my sister. I had no idea who. I remember there being so many people. I think a lot of it was just people from the neighborhood that had come running up. I'm just wondering about everyone. Everyone I saw, I'm wondering, could they have done something like this?
Risa's body is taken to the morgue. Detective Rick Thibodeau and his team search the crime scene for clues.
There was no forced entry at all. Fingerprints we found belonged to the people inside. We had hair on her, but it had no ball to the hair.
The hair is missing its root, so it's of no forensic value to investigators.
Back then, you could have hairs and fibers, but no DNA back then. We had minimal evidence besides the body itself. Nothing. Zero.
Instead, investigators focus on the last people to see Risa Trexler alive.
You just had to eliminate everybody in that family and everybody that was in the house at one time. Everybody had an opportunity.
I was at work after leaving Risa's house, and all of a sudden the police came in, grabbed me, and started questioning me. And that's how I found out she'd been murdered. Overwhelmed, shocked, surprised. I don't know how to explain this carefree day, and then boom, you're taken away. Somebody needed to get arrested for this. I was petrified it was going to be me. I was contemplating leaving the country, and I hadn't done anything. That's the level of fear I had.
Police repeatedly interview both Paul and Risa's other friend, Jim.
It was so painful, they completely blamed everyone that was close to Risa. The police were really looking for a Hail Mary.
Police can't link Jim or Paul to Risa's murder, but they never say so publicly.
If it appears that you can't clear them, they're still suspects. That's why you continue doing the investigation.
Investigators focus next on the man who found Risa's body, her grandfather, Walt Monroe.
When Walt left, Risa was alive, she was happy, in good spirits. And when he came back, he found her dead. And when I interviewed him, he was very cooperative. He had a hard time to be interviewed. He was tore up very bad. I mean, it was really sad to see him. When you're kind of accused of being involved with a homicide, it's your granddaughter. It's hard to live with. But he told the truth. And then that, to me, just about cleared Walt. Once the autopsy came back, the ME found there was multiple stab wounds. 3 of them were deep, deep cuts. The last one was the knife that stuck in her shoulder, which separated her vertebrae. They did a vaginal swab, found semen, and they did find the semen on her leg.
They knew that there had been intercourse. They never could prove whether it was something consensual or whether she had actually been raped. But I knew my sister. Our family knew her. We knew she had to have been raped.
With zero progress in the investigation, the people of Salisbury start to come up with their own theories.
So many people think they have the answers. I think people, they need someone to blame. Being in a small town like this, the rumors just go crazy.
I clearly remember at the time that you could hear stories of, it was so-and-so.
That Paul used the sandwich knife to kill Risa.
That it had to be the family.
That, she had a boyfriend.
That my grandfather caught her with someone and got mad.
It was a very surreal time because there was so much misinformation. Rumors are flying around, fingers are pointing. It was crazy.
I even heard rumors about my grandfather, that he had been molesting us, which none of that was true. Our grandfather would have never hurt us in any way whatsoever.
The mounting rumors and accusations take a toll on this grieving family.
It must have been horrible for my father. He was a loving gentleman. He loved us so dearly. He was never the same after that. My dad passed away in 2007, and it's very sad that my dad never got resolution to Risa's death. It hurts a lot to have all these unanswered questions. Just not to know what happened to my daughter.
Imagine you're living in a really safe, small town, and you're just hanging out with your friends, and an hour later, the police are coming to grab you to tell you that your friend has been murdered. We're absolutely not prepared to hear anything like that.
And if you went to the grocery store, if you went to church, that's what people were talking about. It was all over town. People were scared at that time because no one was caught. And you've got this circle of suspicion, and then that circle kept getting bigger.
4 days after Risa's murder, her family gathers to say goodbye. It's for a 13-year-old whose sister has just been murdered.
To some people meant that I didn't care, that I was emotionless. Just because I can't have an emotional breakdown in front of other people does not mean that I don't break down on my own.
So people were looking at this young girl and expecting her to act in a certain way to mourn the death of her sister. And when she didn't do that, that made her a suspect. And I think maybe police listened to that. They had to pursue every lead they had, and those were the kind of leads they were getting then.
Jody became a suspect shortly thereafter the homicide.
Jody was next door by herself when her sister was killed, leaving her with no alibi.
They were saying in that 45-minute period of time, I was able to go overpower my sister, do the damage that was done to her. I had no wounds, cuts, anything defensive on me. None of it made sense. The rumors were coming from everywhere, but Risa's best friend, she was a big facilitator of a lot of these rumors. Her mother actually worked for the post office. I know that the detectives spent a lot of time at the post office. They would go up there. They were in close contact with all the reporters. They would tell everyone how I had done it.
Even my friends were blaming Jody. My family was blaming Jody. Risa's murder tore Jody and I apart, and we lost contact.
It seems to Jody that the cops are listening to the rumors a little too much.
At one point, the police were trying to say that they thought there were 2 people involved and one of them was a female. So I know they were talking about me. There were rumors that I had unlocked the door for Paul.
My colleagues made some statements to that effect, but we had arguments about it. I didn't believe it because her friends were good people. Jody was interviewed by one of my colleagues. She knew the family very well, and she trusted him.
The police didn't come right out and tell me they were suspicious of Jody, but other people started telling me. And then it became obvious by the questions they asked.
They tried to come up with so many things. They claimed to have found a fingernail broken off that was in the bedroom. Very possibly could have been. My sister and I were in that room all the time. But I was made to give fingernail samples, hair samples, pubic hair samples, saliva samples. That's not something easy for a 13-year-old to have to cope with. And you're wondering, are they going to arrest me and put me in jail?
Jody was in shock. She's a 13-year-old girl who just saw her sister's dead body. I don't think she had the tools to handle that situation.
At some point, the police put their focus on one thing in the investigation and never looked anywhere else. And that was that either I had killed my sister or I had helped someone kill my sister. You hear stories all the time of detectives getting tunnel vision and focusing on one person and not seeing any other evidence around them. And that just seemed to be what happened.
In the early stages, I trusted the police, but it seemed that they didn't want to do anything except talk to me about Jody. And I started asking Jody the questions that the police asked me. What did you do that day? What did Risa do that day? Until it just got to where she didn't want to talk to me anymore. I knew in my heart that she didn't, but the police put such a doubt in my mind about Jody that I was almost suicidal.
From my point of view, I'm your child. Why can't you believe me? What, you know, I'm here in front of you telling you, I've told you 1,000,000 times, you're my mother, you're supposed to believe me. So I just couldn't understand that she could be believing the police and all these other people over me. I used to block it out and not think about it. I was a messed up teenager. You lose all your friends. You start getting into a lot of things. I was angry at my mom, angry at my family, angry at the police, angry at everybody.
Jody ran away one time and called me and told me she wasn't going to come back until we could sit down and not have to, not interrogate her anymore. It tore my relationship with Jody. Things get said that one might take the wrong way, and the doubt just draws the line between you. Years go by. The hurt didn't go away. The hurt just stayed. Christmases were very hard. Every holiday was hard, in fact. I had come to the conclusion that it wasn't going to be solved. I had just about resigned myself to that fact.
After interviewing every possible witness and exploring every lead, Detective Rick Thibodeau runs out of options. And the case of the teenager murdered in her grandparents' spare room goes cold.
We interviewed hundreds of people and went on and on and on. And we exhausted every investigative technique and come to a dead end.
In Salisbury, the gossip about Jody and her family simmers on.
In the absence of someone being arrested, you have to talk about somebody. But there were times over the years that different detectives wanted to look at that case just because it was so high profile. And every time they would do that, when they would go back out and talk to people, rumors would start up again. Oh, did you hear the police were over there talking to her?
I would like to know what happened to my daughter. I'd like to know what she was doing, why this happened.
Vicki Oakes and her father, Walter Monroe, say they don't want pity. They want action. Action to find who killed Vicki's daughter, Risa.
We haven't received any action from the Salisbury Police Department, and we feel like that this thing can be solved.
Do you think the police department is doing everything it can?
No. I don't.
What more could it do?
they could try harder to find the murderer.
I had lost all my faith in the police. I think my family had at that point, too.
The Trexler family, particularly Jody, remained under a cloud of suspicion from a lot of folks.
I think people, they need someone to blame. They need some reason. They have to have something. And sometimes people like the worst possible scenario. I guess it's more interesting to talk about.
That family went through hell and hell and hell and back.
Imagine being in a town of 30,000 people with everyone blaming you. Every restaurant you go into, everywhere you go, and no one supported you for all these years.
It carried over into my adult life quite a bit. Seems like everywhere I've worked, there's always been someone who would find out who I was. And I've been called axe murderer. I've been called so many names. I've had neighbors scream at me and call me murderer. She was my sister. I loved her very much.
The rumors about Jody never die down. And when social media emerges, the gossip intensifies.
Right after Facebook started getting big, I happened to see different posts about my sister. And they have Facebook groups against me. And Risa's supposed best friend at the time she passed. She was the leader of the Facebook hate group, so I joined it, and then I was kicked out of it.
The 3 teens who were with Risa the day she was killed are forever haunted by her murder.
The investigation from the state police affected Jim in a way that he just declined over time.
Hey, Paul, this is Jim. Going back into another rehab. I love you like a brother, and I hope that we can get past this.
And the alcohol and the drugs finally caught up to him. He died when he was like 48 years old.
Paul and I lost touch. He had kind of started falling into the whole believing what everybody else was saying about me.
I believed the rumor mill. I thought Jody had done it. That's what the town was telling me. That's what my parents were telling me.
It just makes you mad when you want to set everyone straight and you want to tell the world this did not happen, and you really have no way of making them believe you. It angers you. So many times I'd lay there and think, wow, I wish I could shut some of these people up. And so one day, Dr. Phil happened to be on TV. I would just see him doing polygraphs on so many people. I just happened to send them an email that I just pretty much spilled out just the situation that my sister had been brutally murdered when we were kids, and I grew up taking the brunt of the blame, and it had affected my life. I never expected anyone to respond, but they did.
Jody and I's relationship has gotten better over the years. But when she first told me I was against the idea of her going on the show, I thought it would just drag up bad feelings again.
I just wanted to be able to prove I did not do it. I don't know why the police never gave me a polygraph. I used to beg for them to give me a polygraph. Why did that never happen? I do not know why.
Today on an all-new Dr. Phil, her sister was stabbed 18 times.
When I finally took the polygraph, it was about a 2-hour process, but they only read the 2 most important ones on the show.
Did you stab Risa?
When I took the polygraph, I wanted to somehow, some way, prove to the world that I did not kill Risa.
And the results are that you were telling the truth. You did not stab your sister.
I was thrilled. I'm thinking, all right, now people can leave me alone and maybe something can happen. Maybe they can start focusing on someone else.
I was just very happy. I was very proud of her at that point.
Jody's TV appearance pushes Reese's murder into the national spotlight, and that puts pressure on local cops in North Carolina. After 3 decades, the case finally heats up.
There is some new information that we're looking into.
Police say they welcome the new leads that have been created by the publicity recently given the case.
After over 30 years, Reese's murder is a terrible yet fading memory for many in Salisbury. Others, like the city's new cold case detective, are too young to remember it at all.
When Risa was killed, I was 6 years old, and I lived in Salisbury. I don't know that I was aware of this case before I became a police officer, but once I became a detective, I heard other detectives talk about the case and people in the community.
Detective Schulenberger contacted me the second day after the show aired and told me then that he was going to be looking into things.
Jody was a little apprehensive when I first sat down and talked to her, but she was happy that we were taking a look at the case.
And he told me that day that he really did not believe that I could have done that. And I don't know if he was just saying that. I know detectives have their lines that they say to people.
Jody just came in one night and told me that she had been working with Schulenberger and that they were bringing some new stuff up. And so I didn't think much about it. I just kind of thought, well, here we go again. I thought it would be just more run around again.
Travis knew the rumors, and I think he wanted to put this to bed for the family and for the community.
He asked me if I would be willing to do another polygraph under their examiner, and he really made me feel comfortable about it. So I did another one, passed it.
We made sure all the evidence was there like it was supposed to be, and we got in touch with North Carolina State Crime Lab, and we talked about what evidence there was, what might be beneficial to resubmit.
The case had long divided Jody's family and friends, but they start to heal after her TV appearance.
I think it made my mother realize a little bit more just how it felt for me. I've had a lot of resentment towards her over this, but she's still my mother. I love her.
I knew instantly just watching her talk, and she didn't do anything. I came to a point where the rumors didn't make sense anymore.
I wake up and I have a long post, public post on my Facebook from Paul, just apologizing. It was just one of the nicest things I had heard from anybody.
And I remember talking to Jody on the phone. First time we've talked in 34 years. And I just started apologizing. After we got over the initial, I'm sorry, Jody and I started investigating who we thought could have possibly did it. We started going old boyfriends, family, neighbors, anyone that would have a reason to kill Risa.
Paul and I, we just went crazy, investigating everything we possibly could. We were like our own little detective agency.
Detective Schulenberger opens up boxes of forensic evidence that have been closed for years. What he finds gives him hope.
The initial crime scene investigators did an outstanding job, not knowing what technology would be available in 2018. But, now we've got a chance. There was semen in the blood on her body. There's semen on the vaginal swab. And we got in touch with North Carolina State Crime Lab and got it submitted. Just please let us get a DNA profile.
Schulenberger waits on pins and needles for the test results. 1 week later, the report comes in, and it blows this 30-year-old case wide open.
I was at my desk one day, and when I found out, we got a DNA profile from the sperm. That was the biggest moment of the case for me. We had something to work with.
There's no match in any of the national DNA databases. So Detective Schulenberger widens the search using the relatively new science of familial DNA testing.
And I worked with another crime lab out of state to have the genealogical DNA work done, and they were able to look at relatives. They're able to deduce it down to a specific person.
Oh, it was agonizing waiting. But their person was able to somehow match this man from some third cousins, I believe it was. And they finally gave us a name, and it was no one any of us had ever heard of.
WBTV's David Wizard has been covering this case for years now. David, what was the reaction from the family to this news?
Maureen, I have to say it was shock, relief, confirmation. Turns out, according to police and DNA results, it was a random man who worked nearby who had no connection to the family or to Risa Trexler.
After all the years of rumor, suspicion, and turmoil, Jody finally has some measure of relief.
It brought me to tears. I just sat there and cried by myself, just knowing this is it. We've got him. And this is going to be over.
Finally, Jody knows the name of the man who killed her big sister Risa on that summer day back in 1984.
Risa's killer's name was Curtis Edward Blair. The man that killed Risa was working at the Frito-Lay factory. It's just diagonally on the next block over. So he would have to get from the Frito-Lay factory on this side of the block over there. He could have cut through this road.
We couldn't find out a lot about Curtis Edward Blair, but at some point he left Salisbury, moved to California.
Detective Schulenberger combs old court records from coast to coast and finds that Blair has a string of arrests in New York and California.
Also, we found that he had been to prison for assault with a deadly weapon.
But then the trail goes cold, until with a little more research, Schulenberger finds out the crushing truth. The suspect will never face justice. Curtis Edward Blair is dead.
He had passed away in 2004. That was a big letdown to hear that.
That was a blow. You know, I wanted the person to know we found him. I wanted the family to have the opportunity to see him go to prison.
Throughout all of this, you kept thinking, one of these days when it's solved, we're going to get to sit down and look this person in the face and ask some questions. But we don't get to ask a lot of the questions that we really want to know. We'll never have those answers.
To close this case and clear Jody's name, Detective Schulenberger has to make sure the familial DNA link to Blair is rock solid. To do that, investigators have to collect DNA from Blair's body.
We had the DNA profile from the sperm, but we needed that confirmation that, yes, this is your person. So we had to exhume the body to get a DNA profile from the body. And that's what we did. And we're able to get a match. Hey, I'm Travis Schulenberger. And talk to you about the Risa Trexler homicide. We would like to say that Jody has been completely exonerated in this case.
I think we can walk down the street and look at people and everything a lot differently now. I had all three of my children there with me. I wanted to make sure they were there with me. Detective Schulenberger said Jody Laird has been exonerated. And to hear him say it and to hear him to tell the world, it's mind-blowing.
It was a great moment.
I was happy for the family. You know, all the turmoil they went to, the sadness, the grief, the hatred, gossip, innuendos, lies, name it, they had it through there.
Now, people who have been under this cloud of suspicion for 35 years are out from under it now, and it's gone. People in the community can stop talking about this family. They didn't do it. This guy did.
He stole part of my life. It'll never be over. Because my daughter died that tragic way, that horrible way, and it'll always be in my mind how she suffered. I'll always think about that.
Even though it's solved and questions are answered, that longing for that person just never goes away. I don't like the word closure. It's just something someone made up one day and thought it would give people some relief, but it doesn't. You know, your sister's still never going to come back. That's never going to change.
In the early 1990s, Houston, Texas, stood as one of the largest and fastest-growing cities in the United States. The city's economy continued to diversify after the challenges of the previous decade, while expanding neighborhoods, new residential developments, and busy transportation corridors reflected a metropolitan area that was constantly changing. Families moved into growing suburban communities, schools served an increasingly diverse population, and daily life followed familiar routines shaped by work, education, recreation, and neighborhood gatherings. Like many large American cities of the period, Houston was also confronting concerns about crime and gang activity in certain areas, issues that drew attention from local authorities and residents alike. Yet for the overwhelming majority of people, everyday life remained defined by ordinary moments rather than extraordinary danger. Children attended school, friends gathered for celebrations, parents expected their sons and daughters to return home after spending time with classmates, and evenings passed with the quiet predictability that most communities rely upon. The year 1993 unfolded within this broader setting. Summer brought long daylight hours, warm evenings, and opportunities for teenagers to spend time outdoors with friends before the responsibilities of another school year. Social gatherings, birthday celebrations, and neighborhood parties formed a familiar part of adolescent life. Such occasions represented moments of independence, allowing young people to strengthen friendships while still remaining close to home. For parents, these events were generally viewed as ordinary milestones of growing up. A walk between familiar streets, a visit to a friend's home, or an evening spent at a local gathering rarely appeared remarkable. These seemingly insignificant routines were repeated countless times across Houston, every week without incident. Among the thousands of teenagers living in the city were Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena. Jennifer was 14 years old. Elizabeth was 16. They were at an age marked by the gradual transition between childhood and adulthood, when friendships occupied an important place in daily life and social occasions carried particular significance. Their names would later become known far beyond Houston, but on the evening that would ultimately define their place in history, they were simply two young girls participating in an ordinary activity shared by countless teenagers. The available facts surrounding the beginning of that evening are remarkably simple. Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena attended a party. Nothing about that decision distinguished them from many other adolescents enjoying time with friends. Gatherings of this kind were common, particularly during the summer months when school schedules allowed greater freedom. Friends met to celebrate birthdays, spend time together, and enjoy a temporary escape from academic routines. Such events often concluded with guests returning home by familiar routes, expecting the remainder of the evening to unfold without difficulty. It is often the ordinary beginnings of historical events that make them especially difficult to comprehend in retrospect. Looking back through the lens of later knowledge, there is a natural temptation to search for warning signs or decisive moments that might have altered the course of events. Yet history rarely presents itself so clearly to those living through it. Jennifer and Elizabeth could not have viewed their evening through the perspective that later generations would possess. To them, attending a party and beginning the journey home represented nothing extraordinary. It was another summer evening nearing its conclusion. Houston itself continued its normal rhythm. Streets remained active with traffic moving between neighborhoods. Families settled into their homes after the day's activities. Businesses closed while others prepared for overnight operations. The city did not pause because two teenagers were walking home. It continued as every major city does, with thousands of unrelated stories unfolding simultaneously across its neighborhoods. This contrast between the ordinary and the unimaginable has become one of the defining characteristics of many criminal cases that later receive widespread public attention. The circumstances at the beginning often appear almost painfully familiar. There is no dramatic opening, no immediate indication that history is about to change course for the individuals involved. Instead, ordinary decisions unfold one after another until a sequence of events emerges that no participant could reasonably have anticipated. Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena began their walk home after leaving the party. This detail, simple in its wording, would eventually become one of the most frequently repeated facts associated with the case. At the time, however, it carried no particular significance. Walking home was an ordinary means of returning after spending time with friends. The route itself represented a transition from one familiar place to another. Countless young people completed similar walks every day without encountering danger. For investigators who would later reconstruct the events of that night, establishing this timeline became an essential starting point. Historical investigations frequently begin with the final confirmed ordinary actions of those involved. Where were they last seen? Who observed them? What decisions were known rather than assumed? In this case, one verified fact stood at the center of the chronology. Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena had attended a party before beginning the journey home on foot. The simplicity of that timeline has contributed to the lasting impact of the case. Complex criminal investigations often involve intricate financial records, long-standing personal disputes, or relationships that evolve over many years. Here, the known sequence began with an activity that required little explanation. Two teenagers attended a social gathering and later started walking home. That straightforward progression made subsequent events especially difficult for the community to comprehend. The historical significance of criminal cases is not determined solely by the severity of the crime itself, but also by the questions they leave behind. Some cases become symbols because they challenge assumptions that communities have long accepted. An ordinary route home is expected to remain just that, ordinary. Families assume that familiar streets connect one safe place to another. Friends say goodbye expecting to meet again soon. These expectations are woven into everyday life so deeply that they often remain unnoticed until they are broken. As Houston residents learned of the investigation that would later unfold, many recognized elements of their own lives within the known facts. Parents had children who attended neighborhood gatherings. Teenagers regularly walked short distances between friends' homes. Communities relied upon shared assumptions about routine safety. Although crime was not unknown in Houston during the early 1990s, ordinary social activities continued because daily life depends upon a degree of trust in familiar surroundings. Historical accounts must distinguish carefully between verified fact and later interpretation. It would be inaccurate to attribute thoughts or emotions to Jennifer and Elizabeth that cannot be documented. Likewise, it would be inappropriate to construct fictional conversations or imagined warnings simply to increase dramatic effect. The available facts instead invite a quieter form of reflection. Two teenage girls attended a party. They left and began walking home. Those are the established points from which every subsequent investigation proceeded. The significance of these facts became clearer only after events moved beyond ordinary experience. Cases that later become widely remembered often begin in precisely this manner, with a sequence so commonplace that it initially attracts no attention. Only afterward does each step acquire historical importance because investigators, journalists, courts, and communities repeatedly return to reconstruct the final ordinary moments before violence intervened. Years later, discussions of the case would continue to emphasize this contrast. The opening chapter was never defined by unusual behavior or extraordinary decisions. Instead, it reflected the routine independence associated with adolescence. Jennifer Ertman, 14 years old, and Elizabeth Pena, 16 years old, spent part of an evening at a party before making the familiar decision to head home. That decision alone contained nothing remarkable. Yet history often turns not on extraordinary beginnings, but on ordinary moments interrupted by forces beyond the expectations of those involved. The path between one destination and another, measured in minutes rather than hours, can become the setting for events that permanently alter families, communities, and the historical memory of a city. Houston in 1993 could not anticipate that one evening would eventually be remembered among its most widely discussed criminal cases. The city continued with its routines, unaware that investigators, prosecutors, courts, and journalists would later devote years to understanding what happened after two teenagers left a gathering and began walking home. The central question, therefore, emerged not because the beginning was unusual, but because it was so profoundly ordinary. How could a routine walk home after a party become the opening chapter of one of Houston's most notorious criminal cases? Every confirmed fact available at this point points back to that same ordinary sequence. Two friends, one 14 and one 16, attended a party and started home on foot. The answers to what followed would only emerge through a careful criminal investigation grounded in evidence rather than assumption. As Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena continued their journey through Houston that evening, their walk remained, for a brief time longer, simply another unremarkable passage across familiar streets. Then, before they could reach home, their path was interrupted when they were confronted by a group of gang members, marking the moment when an ordinary summer evening gave way to a criminal investigation that would leave a lasting place in the history of Houston. In historical accounts of criminal investigations, it is often easy for the attention of later generations to become fixed on the crime itself. Names become associated with court proceedings, legal decisions, and the identities of those responsible. Yet every investigation begins not with a criminal file or a courtroom, but with individuals whose lives existed long before they became victims. In the case that unfolded in Houston, Texas, in 1993, the names Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena should first be understood in that context. Before they became central figures in one of the city's most widely remembered criminal cases, they were two teenage girls whose lives followed the ordinary rhythms of adolescence. Jennifer Ertman was 14 years old. Elizabeth Pena was 16. Their ages alone illustrate a stage of life defined by gradual independence while still remaining firmly within childhood. Teenagers at 14 and 16 often begin to experience greater freedom in deciding how to spend time with friends, attending social gatherings, and traveling short distances without direct adult supervision. These experiences are commonly viewed as part of growing older, reflecting increasing trust between parents and children rather than unusual circumstances. The available verified information concerning Jennifer and Elizabeth is intentionally limited, and historical accuracy requires respecting those limits. It would be inappropriate to invent personal histories, conversations, ambitions, or family circumstances that are not supported by the factual record provided. Instead, what remains certain is both simple and significant. Jennifer Ertman was 14 years old. Elizabeth Pena was 16 years old. On the evening in question, they attended a party together before beginning the walk home. This sequence places the girls within a familiar social setting rather than an exceptional one. Parties among teenagers represented common occasions for friendship and recreation throughout Houston during the early 1990s. Such gatherings offered opportunities to spend time with classmates and acquaintances outside school, particularly during periods when academic responsibilities were reduced. Families generally regarded these occasions as ordinary parts of adolescence. The expectation was straightforward. Young people would enjoy an evening with friends and return home safely afterward. Nothing in the verified facts suggests that Jennifer and Elizabeth were engaged in unusual activity. Their evening reflected a pattern repeated countless times across Houston and throughout the United States. Adolescents attended celebrations, visited friends, and later made their way home. Most of these evenings ended without incident, reinforcing the confidence families placed in familiar neighborhoods and established routines. The importance of understanding this ordinary context cannot be overstated. Criminal investigations sometimes involve victims whose circumstances immediately draw public attention because they were engaged in dangerous occupations, high-profile disputes, or unusual situations. That was not the case here based on the verified information available. Jennifer and Elizabeth were participating in an activity that thousands of other teenagers experienced every week. Their presence at a party required no special explanation, nor did the decision to leave and begin walking home. From the perspective of investigators who would later reconstruct the chronology, the girls' known movements established the foundation of the case. Determining where victims were last known to be, who last observed them, and what activities preceded the crime forms a standard component of investigative procedure. In this instance, the confirmed sequence began with the party and continued with the decision to walk home. Those facts would become the earliest reliable points on the investigative timeline. For historians and legal scholars examining criminal cases, such moments carry particular significance because they represent the last confirmed period during which events remained entirely ordinary. Before any criminal act occurred, Jennifer and Elizabeth were simply completing an evening with friends. Their decisions reflected ordinary expectations rather than extraordinary risks. This distinction remains essential because it demonstrates that the tragedy which followed cannot be explained by speculation about unusual behavior. The available evidence instead begins with routine activities familiar to countless families. Houston itself provided the broader backdrop to these events. By 1993, the metropolitan area had grown into one of America's largest cities, bringing together communities from diverse cultural and economic backgrounds. Residential neighborhoods expanded alongside commercial development, while transportation networks connected different parts of the city. Within this large urban environment, millions of routine journeys occurred every day. Teenagers traveled between schools, recreational facilities, shopping areas, and friends' homes. Parents expected these movements to be completed safely because, in the overwhelming majority of cases, they were. At the same time, law enforcement agencies remained aware of criminal activity affecting parts of a city, including gang-related offenses. Public officials, community organizations, and police departments devoted considerable attention to addressing these challenges. Nevertheless, awareness of crime did not eliminate ordinary daily life. Families continued to celebrate birthdays, organize neighborhood gatherings, and encourage friendships among young people. Daily routines persisted because communities cannot function without a degree of confidence in ordinary public spaces. Against this wider setting, Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena occupied no exceptional position. They were not public figures. They were not involved in ongoing criminal investigations. They had not become subjects of media attention before the events that later unfolded. Their names entered public consciousness only because of what happened after they left the party. This distinction matters because it shifts attention away from sensationalism and toward the human reality underlying every criminal investigation. The purpose of recounting their story is not to transform tragedy into spectacle, but to understand how ordinary lives became intertwined with an extraordinary crime. Historical accuracy requires preserving that perspective throughout the narrative. The verified chronology remains concise. Jennifer and Elizabeth attended a party. At some point afterward, they began walking home. Those facts alone describe a sequence that thousands of parents would have considered entirely unremarkable. Indeed, had the evening concluded as expected, no public record would likely exist documenting those movements. The journey home would have remained another forgotten moment within the countless routines of daily life. Instead, investigators would later examine those same ordinary decisions with exceptional care. Every confirmed movement acquired evidentiary value because it established the final period during which the girls' whereabouts and activities could be reliably reconstructed. Criminal investigations frequently depend upon identifying these final confirmed observations before contact with offenders occurs. The girls' ages also influenced how the community viewed the case. 14 and 16 represent years associated with education, friendships, family life, and personal development. They are stages marked by anticipation of future opportunities rather than by public notoriety. Consequently, when the investigation later became known, many members of the public recognized not only the victim's youth, but also the familiarity of the circumstances preceding the crime. Countless families could imagine their own children attending similar gatherings or walking comparable routes home. As later legal proceedings unfolded, the names Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena remained central not because of extensive public biographies, but because they represented lives interrupted during an otherwise ordinary evening. Their identities reminded observers that criminal cases are ultimately measured not only by legal outcomes, but also by the individuals whose futures were permanently taken away. The historical record, therefore, begins with restraint rather than dramatic embellishment. Jennifer Ertman, 14 years old, and Elizabeth Pena, 16 years old, spent part of an evening at a party in Houston during 1993. When the gathering concluded, they began the walk home together. Their actions reflected ordinary adolescent independence, supported by familiar social routines. Nothing within the verified facts indicates that the beginning of their journey differed from countless others undertaken by teenagers throughout the city. Yet it was precisely this ordinary beginning that made the events to come so difficult for investigators and the wider community to comprehend. A routine walk after an evening with friends should have ended at home. Instead, as Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena continued along their route, they encountered a group of gang members who stopped them, bringing their ordinary evening to an abrupt and irreversible turning point. The investigation that followed would seek to establish, through evidence rather than speculation, exactly how that encounter developed into one of Houston's most significant criminal cases. The transition from an ordinary evening to a criminal investigation can often be traced to a single moment, although the full significance of that moment is rarely understood until much later. For Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena, the verified sequence of events remained straightforward until their journey home was interrupted. After attending a party in Houston, Texas, in 1993, the two teenagers began walking home together. At some point during that walk, they encountered a group of gang members who stopped them. From that point forward, the evening ceased to follow the routine course that had begun only hours earlier and instead became the subject of one of Houston's most widely remembered homicide investigations. The available factual record establishes that Jennifer Ertman, who was 14 years old, and Elizabeth Pena, who was 16, were confronted by members of a gang while making their way home. Historical accuracy requires remaining within the limits of those verified facts. Although later court proceedings and investigative records would reconstruct the crime in detail, the information provided here supports only the established sequence that the girls were stopped by a group of gang members, held against their will for several hours, and ultimately killed. From an investigative perspective, the interruption of the girls' journey marked the beginning of the criminal acts that would later become the focus of law enforcement. Prior to that encounter, every confirmed activity formed part of an ordinary evening. Afterward, the situation changed entirely. Jennifer and Elizabeth were no longer free to continue their journey home. Their movements were controlled by others, transforming what had been a routine walk into a prolonged criminal event. The passage of several hours became one of the defining factual elements of the case. Rather than a brief confrontation, the victims were held under the control of the offenders for an extended period. This duration significantly influenced both the later investigation and the legal proceedings. Establishing the timeline became an essential task for investigators because every confirmed period of time contributed to understanding the sequence of criminal acts that had taken place. For the families of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena, the expected conclusion to the evening never arrived. A routine social gathering had been followed by what should have been an ordinary walk home. Instead, the girls failed to return as anticipated. Such moments often represent the earliest indication that an ordinary event has become something far more serious. Families initially search for ordinary explanations, believing that delays may result from unexpected conversations, changes in plans, or other harmless circumstances. Only later does the absence begin to suggest that something far more significant has occurred. Meanwhile, the city of Houston continued its normal activities, unaware that a crime of exceptional seriousness was unfolding. Thousands of residents completed their evening routines without knowledge that two teenagers had been prevented from reaching home. The contrast between the city's ordinary rhythm and the circumstances affecting Jennifer and Elizabeth would later become one of the most striking aspects of the case. Public awareness would come only after the crime had already occurred. The available verified information also establishes that, after several hours of being held, Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena were killed. Any further description beyond this verified fact would risk introducing unsupported details or unnecessary sensationalism. Historical integrity requires recognizing that the gravity of the crime does not depend upon graphic description. The loss of two young lives is sufficiently significant without embellishment. Following the killings, the offenders attempted to conceal evidence of the crime. This action represented an effort to prevent investigators from identifying those responsible and reconstructing the events that had occurred. Attempts to hide evidence are common features in many homicide investigations because offenders frequently seek to delay discovery or complicate law enforcement efforts. In this case, however, the attempt to conceal what had happened did not prevent the investigation from progressing. At the time these actions were taking place, no public understanding existed regarding the sequence of events. The girls' families, friends, and the broader Houston community could not yet know what had happened after Jennifer and Elizabeth left the party. The timeline that later appeared clear through investigative reconstruction was not immediately available to anyone. Instead, investigators would eventually have to establish every confirmed fact through evidence, witness accounts, and careful examination of the circumstances. One of the enduring characteristics of this case is the stark contrast between its beginning and its outcome. The evening commenced with an ordinary social gathering attended by two teenagers. Nothing within the verified chronology suggested an extraordinary risk before the encounter with the gang members occurred. That ordinary beginning has remained central to historical discussions because it demonstrates how rapidly familiar circumstances can change through the actions of offenders. As the hours passed on the night of a crime, the gap between expectation and reality widened. Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena had expected to return home after attending a party. Their families expected them to complete the journey safely. Friends who had seen them earlier in the evening would have had no reason to believe that those ordinary farewells represented the final confirmed moments before a major criminal investigation would begin. For investigators examining the case afterward, the incident itself formed the central section of a chronology around which every other element would later be organized. The events before the encounter established the victim's known movements. The actions during the hours that followed constituted the criminal acts under investigation. Everything afterward would focus on identifying those responsible, determining how the crime had unfolded, and presenting sufficient evidence to support criminal prosecutions. The offender's effort to conceal evidence demonstrated an awareness that the crimes would become the subject of law enforcement scrutiny. Yet concealment alone could not erase the sequence of events that had already taken place. Criminal investigations rely upon assembling independent sources of information, comparing witness accounts, evaluating physical evidence, and reconstructing timelines. Even where offenders attempt to obscure their actions, evidence frequently remains available through multiple avenues of inquiry. The deaths of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena marked not only a profound personal tragedy, but also the beginning of a complex homicide investigation. At this stage of the chronology, however, investigators had not yet assembled the complete picture. The facts known today were established only after systematic investigative work. The immediate challenge facing law enforcement would be determining what had happened after two teenage girls left a party and failed to return home. The historical record, therefore, separates naturally into two distinct phases. The first concerns the criminal acts themselves, the interruption of the girls' walk home, their detention by a group of gang members for several hours, their deaths, and the subsequent attempt by the offenders to conceal evidence. The second phase, still to come, concerns the response of investigators who would begin the process of identifying suspects, gathering evidence, and reconstructing every verified step of the case. As the crime scene and the surrounding circumstances gradually came to the attention of authorities, the investigation entered a new stage. What had begun as an ordinary summer evening for Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena had become a homicide investigation requiring careful examination of evidence, verification of witness information, and the methodical reconstruction of the final hours of the victims' lives. The answers would not emerge immediately, but through a systematic investigation that ultimately demonstrated that efforts to conceal the crime had failed, laying the foundation for the arrests and prosecutions that followed. When a homicide investigation begins, investigators rarely possess a complete understanding of what has occurred. Instead, the process develops through the careful collection of verified information, the examination of physical evidence, and the reconstruction of a timeline supported by facts rather than assumptions. In the case of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena, the investigation that followed their deaths reflected these fundamental principles. What initially existed were unanswered questions surrounding two teenage girls who had attended a party and never returned home. The responsibility of law enforcement was to determine what had happened, identify those responsible, and gather evidence capable of supporting criminal prosecution. The The first objective in any investigation of this nature is the establishment of a reliable chronology. Investigators seek to determine the victim's confirmed movements before the crime, identify the last known point at which they were seen alive, and document every verifiable event that followed. In this case, the factual sequence began with Jennifer Ertman, 14 years old, and Elizabeth Pena, 16 years old, attending a party before beginning the walk home. Those confirmed facts became the foundation upon which every subsequent stage of the investigation would be built. Establishing the timeline served more than a historical purpose. It allowed investigators to narrow the period during which the crimes had occurred and to focus attention on individuals or events connected to that specific interval. Criminal investigations rely heavily upon eliminating uncertainty wherever possible. Every confirmed observation reduces speculation and strengthens the reliability of later conclusions. As investigators gathered information, they also examined the circumstances surrounding the victims' final known movements. Determining the route Jennifer and Elizabeth had taken after leaving the party became an important component of reconstructing the case. Although the available verified information does not describe every investigative technique employed, the objective remained consistent with standard homicide procedure. Identify where the victims had been, establish when their movements changed unexpectedly, and determine how the offenders entered the sequence of events. The investigation soon centered upon the fact that the girls had encountered a group of gang members while walking home. This encounter represented the decisive turning point in the chronology. Before that point, the victims' activities were ordinary and expected. Afterward, they were held against their will for several hours before being killed. Investigators therefore focused considerable attention on identifying the individuals responsible for stopping the girls and reconstructing what had occurred during the period that followed. The available factual record establishes that those responsible attempted to conceal evidence after the killings. Such actions frequently present significant challenges during homicide investigations. When offenders attempt to hide their involvement, investigators must rely upon multiple independent sources of information rather than a single piece of evidence. Physical evidence, witness accounts, and corroborating facts become increasingly important because each element can either confirm or contradict the others. Despite those efforts at concealment, the investigation advanced rapidly. According to the verified information, investigators were able to identify those responsible through witness statements and evidence. This combination proved decisive. Witness testimony provided investigators with information capable of directing the inquiry towards specific individuals, while evidence supplied independent support that strengthened those accounts. The relationship between testimony and evidence is fundamental to criminal investigations because reliable conclusions generally require corroboration rather than reliance upon a single source. Witness statements often serve as the first significant breakthrough in complex criminal cases. Individuals who possess relevant information may have observed suspicious activity, recognized persons connected with the offense, or provided details that help investigators establish the sequence of events. In this investigation, witness statements contributed directly to identifying those responsible. Their value lay not simply in providing names, but in offering information that investigators could compare with other evidence gathered during the inquiry. At the same time, evidence independently supported the developing case. Although the verified information provided here does not specify the exact nature of every piece of evidence, it confirms that evidence, together with witness statements, enabled investigators to identify and apprehend the offenders. The importance of corroborating evidence cannot be overstated. Criminal investigations achieve their greatest reliability when different forms of proof point toward the same conclusion. Independent confirmation reduces the possibility of error and strengthens the foundation for prosecution. As investigators assembled these pieces of information, the apparent complexity created by attempts to conceal the crime gradually diminished. Every verified fact added another component to the developing chronology. The victims had attended a party. They had begun walking home. They had been stopped by gang members. They had been held for several hours. They had been killed. The offenders had attempted to conceal evidence. Witness statements and additional evidence then identified those responsible. Each stage connected logically to the next, allowing investigators to reconstruct the overall sequence without relying upon speculation. The speed with which the investigation progressed following these breakthroughs demonstrated the significance of the information obtained. Once investigators were able to connect witness testimony with supporting evidence, attention shifted from identifying unknown offenders to preparing arrests and documenting the evidence necessary for future court proceedings. This transition represents an important milestone in homicide investigations because it reflects movement from uncertainty toward prosecutable certainty. The arrests themselves marked another critical stage. According to the verified facts, those responsible were apprehended soon after investigators developed the necessary evidence. Arrests in major criminal investigations require more than suspicion alone. Investigators must possess sufficient factual support to justify taking suspects into custody while also ensuring that the integrity of the subsequent prosecution is preserved. Evidence gathered before arrest frequently forms the basis for later courtroom proceedings. Throughout this investigative process, maintaining an accurate record of evidence remained essential. Every witness statement, every confirmed observation, and every item of supporting evidence contributed to a comprehensive account of the crime. Such documentation allows prosecutors to present a coherent chronology in court while enabling defense attorneys and judges to evaluate the reliability of the investigation. Careful documentation also protects the integrity of the judicial process by ensuring that conclusions rest upon verifiable facts rather than assumption. For the families of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena, the progress of the investigation represented the gradual replacement of uncertainty with documented fact. While no investigative success could reverse the loss they had suffered, identifying those responsible constituted a necessary step toward legal accountability. Criminal investigations serve not only to establish what happened but also to provide the evidentiary foundation upon which justice can later be pursued. The Houston community likewise followed the investigation with growing attention as information became available. What had initially appeared as a deeply troubling disappearance and homicide investigation evolved into a case in which investigators identified the offenders through systematic police work. The combination of witness statements and corroborating evidence demonstrated that attempts to conceal the crime had ultimately failed. Looking back from a historical perspective, the investigation illustrates the importance of methodical procedure in serious criminal cases. Rather than depending upon speculation or coincidence, investigators relied upon evidence that could be verified and compared. Witness statements directed attention toward those responsible, while additional evidence strengthened those accounts and allowed law enforcement to proceed with confidence. The resulting arrests reflected the cumulative effect of careful investigative work rather than a single dramatic discovery. By the conclusion of this investigative phase, the essential questions surrounding the identity of the offenders had been answered. Those responsible for stopping Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena, holding them against their will, killing them, and attempting to conceal the crime had been identified and arrested. The investigation had transformed a series of unanswered questions into a documented criminal case supported by witness testimony and evidence. The focus would now shift from police investigators to the courts, where prosecutors would present the accumulated evidence, and the legal system would determine the criminal responsibility of each defendant through the trial process. The conclusion of the investigation marked the beginning of an equally important phase in the pursuit of justice. Once law enforcement officers had identified and arrested those responsible through witness statements and supporting evidence, the case entered the judicial system. At this stage, the responsibility for establishing criminal accountability shifted from investigators to prosecutors and the courts. Every piece of evidence collected during the investigation would now be examined within a legal framework designed to determine guilt or innocence according to the law. The deaths of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena had become not only a homicide investigation, but also a criminal prosecution involving multiple defendants whose actions would be evaluated individually before the court. Preparing a homicide case for trial requires prosecutors to organize the evidence into a clear and coherent chronology. Unlike investigators, whose primary objective is to discover what happened, prosecutors must demonstrate those facts in court using legally admissible evidence. The distinction is significant. Information that assists an investigation does not automatically become evidence that can be presented before a judge or jury. Every witness statement, every documented fact, and every item of supporting evidence must satisfy legal standards governing reliability and admissibility. In this case, the factual foundation had already been established through the investigation. Jennifer Ertman, 14 years old, and Elizabeth Pena, 16 years old, attended a party before beginning the walk home. During that journey, they were stopped by a group of gang members, held against their will for several hours, and killed. Following the crime, the offenders attempted to conceal evidence. Those efforts ultimately failed because investigators identified those responsible through witness statements and additional evidence, leading to their arrests. For prosecutors, presenting the sequence in court required demonstrating not merely that a crime had occurred, but that each defendant participated in the criminal acts according to the evidence gathered during the investigation. When multiple individuals are accused in the same case, courts must consider the role of each person individually, while also examining how their collective actions contributed to the crimes. The legal process, therefore, becomes more complex than a prosecution involving a single defendant, because responsibility must be established separately for every person standing trial. The existence of witness testimony played a central role in this process. Witnesses who had provided information during the investigation became important participants in the judicial proceedings because their observations helped establish the events surrounding the crime and identify those involved. However, testimony alone is generally insufficient in serious criminal cases. Prosecutors seek corroboration through additional evidence so that multiple independent sources support the same factual conclusions. This approach strengthens the credibility of the prosecution's case and reduces reliance upon any single witness. The supporting evidence collected during the investigation served precisely that purpose. Although the verified information provided here does not specify every item presented during the proceedings, it confirms that evidence accompanied witness statements in identifying the offenders. Together, these forms of proof provided prosecutors with the factual basis necessary to proceed through the legal system. Court proceedings also provide defendants with the opportunity to challenge the evidence presented against them. This principle forms an essential component of criminal justice systems because convictions must rest upon evidence that withstands legal scrutiny. Judges evaluate procedural questions, while juries or judges acting as fact-finders determine whether the prosecution has established guilt according to the applicable legal standard. The existence of multiple defendants in this case required careful consideration of each individual's legal responsibility based upon the evidence presented. Throughout the proceedings, the names Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena remained at the center of the case. Although legal arguments focused upon evidence, criminal responsibility, and statutory requirements, the purpose of the trial extended beyond technical legal analysis. The proceedings represented society's formal response to the deaths of two teenage girls whose ordinary evening had been transformed into a criminal case of exceptional seriousness. Every stage of the trial reflected the broader objective of determining accountability through lawful process rather than public opinion. As the evidence was examined, the prosecution sought to demonstrate that the investigation had accurately identified those responsible. The chronology established by investigators became the framework within which witness testimony and supporting evidence were evaluated. Each confirmed fact contributed to a broader narrative supported by documentation rather than speculation. This careful presentation distinguished the courtroom process from public discussion, where incomplete information and assumptions can sometimes overshadow verified evidence. The judicial process also emphasized the importance of individual legal responsibility. Even when crimes involve multiple participants, courts avoid treating defendants as a single group without distinction. Instead, each defendant's conduct must be considered according to the evidence applicable to that individual. This principle ensures that criminal liability reflects proven actions rather than mere association with others. The outcome of the proceedings reflected the strength of the evidence assembled during the investigation. According to the verified facts, all of the defendants were convicted. This result demonstrated that the prosecution had successfully established criminal responsibility before the court. The convictions represented the legal conclusion of the factual questions that investigators had spent considerable effort resolving through witness statements and corroborating evidence. Sentencing followed the convictions, introducing another important legal consideration. The verified information establishes that not every defendant received the same punishment. Some were sentenced to death, reflecting the most severe penalty available under the applicable law at the time. Others ultimately received life imprisonment because they had been juveniles when the crimes were committed. This distinction illustrates an important principle within the legal system. Sentencing may differ among defendants based upon legally relevant factors, including age at the time of the offense. The differing sentences did not alter the findings of guilt. Rather, they reflected the legal framework governing punishment. Courts frequently distinguish between adult and juvenile offenders when determining appropriate sentences, even where convictions arise from the same criminal incident. In this case, that distinction resulted in different ultimate penalties while preserving the convictions of all those found responsible. For the families of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena, the verdicts marked the conclusion of the judicial determination of responsibility. Although no court decision could reverse the events that had occurred in 1993, the convictions established formal legal accountability for the crimes. The investigation had identified the offenders, and the courts had evaluated the evidence, resulting in judgments against every defendant. The case also demonstrated the relationship between effective investigation and successful prosecution. Without the witness statements and supporting evidence that allowed investigators to identify those responsible, prosecutors would not have possessed the factual foundation necessary to secure convictions. Likewise, the investigation alone could not deliver legal accountability without the subsequent judicial process. Together, these stages formed a continuous progression from the discovery of the crime through the final judgments of the court. From a historical perspective, the legal proceedings completed the transition from uncertainty to documented accountability. What began as an ordinary evening for two teenagers had become a criminal investigation, followed by arrests, courtroom proceedings, convictions, and sentences determined according to law. Each stage depended upon the integrity of the one before it, illustrating how evidence collected during an investigation ultimately becomes the basis for judicial decisions. The verdicts closed the principal legal chapter of the case, but they did not end its significance. The deaths of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena continued to resonate within Houston and beyond, reminding communities of the profound human consequences behind criminal prosecutions. While the courts had determined the legal responsibility of those involved, the broader impact of the case would continue to shape public memory long after the final sentences had been imposed, becoming an enduring part of the history of violent crime and criminal justice in Houston. After the convictions in the case of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena, the legal process provided a formal answer to the question of who was responsible for the crime. However, the significance of the case extended beyond the courtroom. The events of 1993 continued to affect the families of the victims, the Houston community, and discussions surrounding criminal justice, punishment, and accountability. The conclusion of a trial does not erase the consequences of a crime. Instead, it often marks the beginning of a longer period during which communities attempt to understand what happened and how such an event should be remembered. For the families of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena, the case represented a loss that could not be measured only through legal documents or court decisions. The investigation and prosecution established the facts surrounding the crime and identified those responsible, but the judicial process could not restore the lives that had been taken. Jennifer and Elizabeth had been teenagers whose futures ended during an ordinary evening that had begun with a social gathering and a walk home. The lasting impact of the case was therefore connected not only to the severity of the crime, but also to the recognition that two young lives had been interrupted. The public response to the case was shaped by the circumstances surrounding the victims. Jennifer was 14 years old, and Elizabeth was 16. Their ages placed them within a stage of life associated with education, friendships, family relationships, and the gradual transition toward adulthood. The fact that their deaths occurred after such an ordinary activity as walking home contributed to the strong reaction from the community. Many people saw aspects of their own lives reflected in the basic details of the story: teenagers spending time with friends, attending gatherings, and expecting to return home afterward. The case also became an example of the difficult questions that arise when multiple offenders are involved in a serious crime. Because the defendants included individuals who had been juveniles at the time of the offense, the sentencing process required consideration of legal differences between adult and juvenile offenders. Some defendants received death sentences, while others ultimately received life imprisonment because of their age when the crime occurred. This distinction reflected the legal system's approach to punishment and responsibility, where the circumstances of each defendant must be considered within the applicable law. The different sentences became part of the broader public discussion surrounding the case. Serious crimes involving young offenders often raise complex questions about accountability, punishment, and rehabilitation. The legal system must balance multiple considerations, including the severity of the crime, the responsibility of each individual, and the circumstances that existed at the time of the offense. In this case, the courts reached different sentencing outcomes while maintaining the central conclusion that all defendants were legally responsible. Beyond the legal consequences, the case contributed to broader conversations about violence involving young people and the role of gangs in criminal activity. The verified facts established that Jennifer and Elizabeth were stopped by gang members, held against their will, and killed. The investigation and prosecution demonstrated the ability of law enforcement and the courts to respond to such crimes through evidence-based procedures. At the same time, the case represented the devastating consequences that criminal actions can have on victims, families, and communities. The investigation itself became an important part of the case's legacy. The offenders had attempted to conceal evidence, but investigators were able to identify those responsible through witness statements and supporting evidence. This outcome reinforced a central principle of criminal investigations. Efforts to hide a crime do not necessarily prevent justice when evidence can be carefully collected, examined, and connected. The work of investigators transformed uncertainty into a documented account of what had occurred. For the Houston community, the case remained significant because it challenged assumptions about safety and ordinary routines. The girls' journey home had begun as something completely familiar. They were not engaged in an unusual activity or involved in a situation that suggested the outcome that would follow. Their experience demonstrated how quickly ordinary circumstances could be changed by the actions of others. The memory of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena became connected to the importance of recognizing victims as individuals rather than allowing their identities to become overshadowed by the crime committed against them. In many criminal cases, public attention naturally focuses on offenders, investigations, and court proceedings. However, the central human reality remains that victims had lives before the crime occurred. They had families, friendships, and futures that existed independently of the events that later brought their names into public discussion. Maintaining that perspective is particularly important in cases involving severe violence. The details of an investigation may attract public attention, but historical understanding requires remembering the people whose lives were directly affected. Jennifer and Elizabeth were not defined only by the circumstances of their deaths. They were two teenagers whose final evening began with an ordinary social event and ended in a crime that would become one of Houston's most remembered cases. The case also illustrates how criminal justice extends beyond the moment of conviction. Investigations, trials, and sentences provide legal conclusions, but communities continue to process the meaning of major crimes long afterward. Public memory often preserves such cases because they represent important moments in discussions about safety, accountability, and the responsibilities of the justice system. Over time, the case became part of the historical record of Houston criminal investigations. Its significance came from several factors combined: the ages of the victims, the circumstances of the crime, the involvement of multiple offenders, the investigative process that led to arrests, and the sentencing outcomes that reflected different legal considerations among defendants. Together, these elements created a case that continued to receive attention long after the courtroom proceedings ended. The aftermath also demonstrated the importance of evidence and procedure in achieving justice. The investigation did not rely on speculation or public assumptions. Instead, investigators used witness statements and evidence to identify the offenders. Prosecutors then presented those facts within the legal system, where defendants were tried and convicted. This progression from investigation to prosecution represented the structured process through which criminal accountability is established. The story of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena therefore remains connected to two different realities: The first is the reality of the crime itself. 2 teenagers were attacked, held against their will for several hours, and killed. The second is the reality of the response that followed. Investigators worked to identify those responsible, prosecutors presented the case in court, and the judicial system delivered convictions and sentences. Both realities are essential to understanding the case fully. Focusing only on the offender's risks, overlooking the victims, and the impact of their loss. Focusing only on the tragedy, without examining the investigation and legal process, leaves out the mechanisms through which accountability was achieved. A complete historical account must include both the human consequences and the institutional response. Years after the events of 1993, the case continued to serve as a reminder of the importance of protecting vulnerable members of communities and ensuring that serious crimes are thoroughly investigated. It demonstrated that even when offenders attempt to hide evidence, careful investigative work can reveal the truth. It also showed that legal outcomes may vary among defendants depending on circumstances recognized by the justice system. Ultimately, the lasting significance of the Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena case is found not only in the crime itself, but in the many lives affected afterward. Their families experienced an unimaginable loss. Houston confronted the reality of a violent crime involving young victims. Investigators and prosecutors carried out the work required to establish responsibility. Courts considered the evidence and issued convictions and sentences. The case remains part of Houston's criminal history because it represents both a tragedy and a demonstration of the justice system's response. Behind every legal document, investigation report, and courtroom decision were 2 young people whose lives ended far too soon. Remembering Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena means recognizing the human cost of crime while also acknowledging the importance of evidence, accountability, and the pursuit of justice. The conclusion of the court proceedings did not mark the end of the significance of a case involving Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena. While the legal system had established responsibility through convictions and sentencing, the broader impact of the crime continued to be felt. Cases involving young victims often remain in public memory because they raise questions that extend beyond the courtroom. They involve not only the actions of those convicted, but also the lives of those who were lost, the families left behind, and the communities that must confront the consequences of violence. Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena enter the public record because of the circumstances surrounding their deaths, but their story began before the crime. They were teenagers living in Houston, Texas, during a period when ordinary activities such as attending a party and walking home represented familiar parts of adolescent life. Jennifer was 14 years old, and Elizabeth was 16. The simple details of their evening became significant only because of the tragedy that followed. The case remained particularly striking because the events began with an ordinary decision. After attending a party, the 2 girls started walking home. There was no indication in the available facts that this evening began differently from countless other gatherings attended by young people. The tragedy emerged not from an unusual plan or extraordinary circumstance, but from an encounter with a group of gang members that changed the course of the night. The criminal justice response that followed required a transition from uncertainty to evidence-based conclusions. Investigators first had to determine what had happened and who was responsible. According to the established facts, the offenders attempted to conceal evidence after the killings. However, investigators were able to overcome those efforts through witness statements and supporting evidence. This process demonstrated the importance of methodical investigation in cases where the circumstances are complex and the offenders attempt to prevent accountability. Once the responsible individuals were identified and arrested, the case moved into the legal system. The purpose of the trial process was to examine the evidence and determine whether the defendants could be held legally responsible. In criminal cases involving multiple defendants, the court must consider the actions and responsibility of each individual. The existence of a group does not remove the requirement for the justice system to establish accountability according to evidence. The convictions of all defendants represented the legal conclusion that the evidence presented was sufficient to establish their responsibility. The outcome reflected the connection between investigative work and judicial review. Without the evidence collected during the investigation and the witness information that helped identify those involved, the prosecution would not have been able to present a complete case before the court. The sentencing phase introduced another important element of the case. Although all defendants were convicted, the punishments were not identical. Some received death sentences, while others were sentenced to life imprisonment because they had been juveniles at the time of the crime. This distinction reflected the legal consideration of age and the different standards applied to individuals who were minors when an offense occurred. The differing sentences became part of the continuing discussion surrounding the case. Criminal justice systems must consider both the seriousness of an offense and the circumstances of the individuals responsible. In this case, the courts recognized the severity of the crime while also applying different sentencing outcomes based on legally relevant factors. The result was a series of convictions with different penalties. The case also demonstrated the difficult balance between remembering victims and discussing offenders. Public attention often focuses heavily on those responsible because investigations and trials naturally center on identifying and prosecuting perpetrators. However, the lasting importance of the case is also found in the lives of Jennifer and Elizabeth, whose futures ended before they had the opportunity to continue growing into adulthood. For communities affected by serious crimes, remembrance often becomes an important part of understanding what occurred. The names of victims can become associated with legal proceedings and historical accounts, but behind those records are individuals whose lives existed before the crime. Jennifer and Elizabeth were not known publicly because of the investigation. They became known because a violent act interrupted their lives and brought their names into a discussion about justice and accountability. The case also illustrated the role of evidence in preventing crimes from disappearing into uncertainty. Attempts to conceal evidence can create challenges, but investigations depend upon gathering information from multiple sources. In this case, witness statements and evidence provided the foundation that allowed authorities to identify those responsible. The eventual convictions showed that concealment efforts did not prevent the justice system from establishing the facts. The significance of the investigation extended beyond the immediate legal outcome. It demonstrated the importance of cooperation between different parts of the justice process. Investigators gathered information and built the factual foundation of the case. Prosecutors presented that information within the courtroom. Judges and legal authorities then applied the law to determine the appropriate outcomes. Each stage played a different role in reaching the final result. The case also became a reminder of the responsibilities involved in addressing serious crimes committed by groups. When multiple individuals participate in a criminal act, determining responsibility requires careful examination of evidence. The justice system must distinguish between association and proven involvement. In the case of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena, the convictions reflected the conclusion that the defendant's responsibility had been established through the legal process. Years after the events of 1993, the case continued to represent one of Houston's most remembered criminal investigations. Its lasting attention came from the combination of several factors: the young ages of the victims, the circumstances of their final journey home, the involvement of multiple offenders, the investigative process that led to arrests, and the sentencing decisions that followed. However, the historical importance of the case does not come only from the severity of the crime. It also comes from the questions it raised about safety, responsibility, and the role of justice after a tragedy. Communities often look to criminal investigations and trials not only for punishment but also for answers. They seek to understand how events occurred and how those responsible can be held accountable. The response to the case showed the importance of preserving factual accuracy. The investigation, prosecution, and sentencing were all based on established evidence and legal procedures. Avoiding speculation is essential because the purpose of a criminal case is not simply to tell a dramatic story, but to determine the truth through reliable information. For Jennifer's and Elizabeth's families, the legal outcome represented recognition of the harm that had been done. The convictions acknowledged that the victims had been wrongfully taken from their families and that those responsible would face consequences under the law. While legal decisions cannot undo a loss, they serve the important function of establishing accountability. The case remains a reminder that behind every criminal investigation are human lives. The evidence collected, the testimony presented, and the sentences imposed all relate back to the individuals at the center of the tragedy. In this case, those individuals were two teenagers who had attended a party and attempted to return home. The passage of time has not changed the fundamental facts. Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena were stopped by gang members while walking home, held against their will for several hours, and killed. The offenders attempted to conceal evidence, but investigators identified them through witness statements and supporting evidence. All defendants were convicted, with some receiving death sentences and others receiving life imprisonment because they had been juveniles when the crime occurred. The case, therefore, remains a part of Houston's history, not only because of the crime itself, but because of the response that followed. It reflects the work of investigators seeking answers, prosecutors presenting evidence, and courts determining responsibility. It also reflects the enduring importance of remembering victims as individuals whose lives had value before they became part of a criminal investigation. Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena's names continue to represent the human cost of violence and the importance of justice. Their story is not only about the events that ended their lives, but also about the lasting responsibility to remember those affected and to understand how evidence, accountability, and the legal system responded to one of Houston's most significant criminal cases. The trial process represented the next major stage in the case of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena. After investigators identified those responsible through witness statements and supporting evidence, and after the defendants were arrested, the focus shifted from discovering what had happened to proving responsibility within the framework of the justice system. A criminal trial serves a specific purpose: to examine evidence, evaluate competing claims, and determine whether the prosecution has established guilt according to the law. For a case involving multiple defendants, the legal process required careful consideration of each individual's role. Although the crime involved a group of offenders, the court could not simply treat all defendants as identical. Each person accused had to be evaluated according to the evidence connected to that individual. This principle is central to criminal justice because punishment must be based on proven responsibility rather than association alone. The prosecution entered the courtroom with the responsibility of presenting the evidence gathered during the investigation. The foundation of the case had been established through a combination of witness statements and additional evidence that allowed investigators to identify the offenders. During trial proceedings, this information became subject to legal examination. Evidence that had guided investigators through the case now had to meet the standards required for a courtroom decision. The prosecution's presentation focused on reconstructing the sequence of events that led to the deaths of Jennifer and Elizabeth. The known chronology began with the two teenagers attending a party in Houston in 1993. Afterward, they began walking home. During that journey, they were stopped by members of a gang. They were then held against their will for several hours before being killed. Following the crime, the offenders attempted to conceal evidence, but investigators were able to identify them through witness statements and supporting evidence. Presenting this timeline in court was essential because criminal trials depend upon a clear connection between events, evidence, and responsibility. A prosecution cannot rely only on the fact that a serious crime occurred. It must demonstrate how the available evidence connects the accused individuals to that crime. The purpose of a trial was therefore to transform the investigative findings into a legally established conclusion. Witness testimony formed an important part of this process. Individuals who had provided information during the investigation contributed to the court's understanding of the case. Their statements helped establish facts surrounding the crime and assisted in connecting the defendants to the events under examination. However, testimony in court is different from information gathered during an investigation because it is subject to formal questioning and legal scrutiny. The courtroom process allows evidence to be challenged. This is a fundamental element of a fair legal system. The prosecution presents its case, while defendants have the opportunity to respond through legal representation. The court must consider the evidence presented by both sides before reaching a decision. This process ensures that convictions are based on a careful evaluation of facts rather than public reaction or assumptions. The defendants in the case faced serious criminal charges connected to the deaths of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena. The severity of the allegations reflected the circumstances established during the investigation. The victims had been stopped while walking home, held for several hours, and killed. The attempt to conceal evidence afterward added another significant element to the prosecution's presentation. As the proceedings continued, the court examined the evidence collected by investigators. The relationship between investigation and trial became especially important. Police work established the factual foundation, but the court's responsibility was to determine whether that foundation met the legal requirements for conviction. The distinction between these two stages ensured that the final outcome was based on evidence evaluated through judicial procedures. The case also demonstrated the challenges involved when crimes are committed by groups. Courts must determine not only what happened but also how responsibility should be assigned among multiple defendants. Each person's actions and involvement must be considered. The legal system recognizes that participation in a group does not remove the need for individual evaluation. The trial attracted significant attention because of the circumstances surrounding the victims and the seriousness of the crime. Jennifer was 14 years old, and Elizabeth was 16. Their ages contributed to the emotional impact of the case, as the victims were teenagers whose lives ended during a routine activity. However, the courtroom process remained focused on evidence and legal standards rather than emotion alone. The purpose of the trial was not to recreate the tragedy for public attention, but to determine accountability. Courts operate through procedures designed to separate verified facts from speculation. The evidence presented had to demonstrate what occurred and establish the responsibility of those accused. This approach reflects the principle that even the most serious criminal cases must be resolved through lawful processes. The convictions that followed confirmed that the prosecution had successfully established the responsibility of all defendants. The court's decision represented the legal conclusion of the questions that had begun with the investigation. The witness statements and evidence that first allowed investigators to identify the offenders had ultimately provided the foundation for the convictions. The trial also marked an important moment for the families of Jennifer and Elizabeth. The legal proceedings provided an official recognition that the victims had been wrongfully killed and that those responsible had been held accountable. While a conviction cannot undo the loss experienced by a family, it represents a formal acknowledgement of responsibility within the justice system. The sentencing phase that followed the convictions introduced additional legal considerations. Some defendants received death sentences, while others received life imprisonment because they had been juveniles at the time of the crime. These different outcomes reflected the court's application of legal standards concerning age and punishment. The convictions were shared among all defendants, but the sentences reflected differences recognized by law. The case later became part of broader discussions about criminal responsibility, particularly in situations involving young offenders and serious crimes. The differing sentences demonstrated the complexity of balancing accountability with legal principles regarding juvenile offenders. Courts must consider both the seriousness of the offense and the circumstances of the individuals involved. The judicial outcome also reinforced the importance of evidence-based investigations. The case had not been resolved through speculation or assumption. Instead, it progressed through a series of documented steps. Investigators gathered information, witnesses provided statements, evidence supported those accounts, suspects were identified, and prosecutors presented the findings in court. Each stage contributed to the final convictions. Looking back, the trial represented the point at which the facts of the case were formally tested and confirmed through the legal system. The investigation had answered the question of who was responsible, but the trial answered the legal question of whether those individuals could be convicted based on the evidence. The court's decision provided that answer. The story of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena remains significant because it combined the personal tragedy of two young victims with a major criminal justice response. Their deaths led to an investigation, a prosecution, convictions, and sentences that became part of Houston's legal history. The courtroom proceedings ensured that responsibility was determined through evidence rather than speculation. The trial ultimately transformed the case from an unresolved crime into a documented matter of criminal accountability. The evidence gathered by investigators, the testimony presented in court, and the decisions reached by the legal system created the official record of what happened. Although the proceedings brought legal resolution, the broader impact of the case continued beyond the courtroom, affecting how the community remembered Jennifer and Elizabeth and how Houston viewed one of the most serious crimes in its recent history. The conclusion of the trial brought the case of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena into a new stage, the determination of punishment. After the defendants were convicted, the legal system faced the responsibility of deciding the appropriate sentences for those found responsible. In criminal cases, sentencing represents a separate phase from conviction. A verdict establishes guilt, but sentencing determines the legal consequences that follow. In this case, the outcomes reflected both the seriousness of the crime and the legal differences between the defendants. The convictions marked a significant moment in the case because they confirmed the findings that had emerged from the investigation. Through witness statements and supporting evidence, investigators had identified those responsible for stopping Jennifer and Elizabeth while they were walking home, holding them against their will for several hours and killing them. The court proceedings then examined those facts through the standards of the legal system, ultimately resulting in convictions for all defendants. However, the sentencing process required additional consideration. The defendants were not all treated identically under the law because their circumstances were not identical. One of the most important factors considered was age. Some individuals involved in the crime had been juveniles at the time the offenses occurred. This distinction became a determining factor in the punishment they received. Some defendants were sentenced to death. At the time of sentencing, this represented the most severe punishment available under the applicable legal system. The sentences reflected the court's assessment of the seriousness of the crimes and the responsibility established through the trial process. The decision to impose such a punishment demonstrated the extreme severity with which the justice system viewed the offenses committed against Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena. Other defendants ultimately received life imprisonment because they had been minors when the crime occurred. This difference illustrates an important principle within criminal law. Sentencing decisions often take into account circumstances beyond the offense itself. While the convictions established that all defendants were responsible, the law recognized differences related to age and legal status at the time of the crime. The distinction between conviction and sentencing is essential to understanding the outcome of the case. The court's finding that all defendants were guilty addressed the question of responsibility. The sentencing decisions addressed how the legal system would respond to that responsibility. These two stages are connected but separate, and the final outcomes reflected both the seriousness of the crime and the legal factors applicable to each individual. For the families of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena, the convictions and sentences represented the completion of the formal justice process. The court decisions acknowledged the harm that had been caused and established that those responsible would face legal consequences. Although no sentence could reverse the loss of two young lives, the legal outcome provided a formal recognition of accountability. The case also became part of broader discussions about punishment and juvenile offenders. When serious crimes involve individuals who were young at the time of the offense, legal systems must address difficult questions about responsibility, punishment, and the possibility of change. Different jurisdictions have approached these questions in different ways, but the underlying issue remains the same. How should society respond when individuals who were not yet adults commit severe crimes? In the case of Jennifer and Elizabeth, the sentencing outcomes reflected the laws and legal principles applied at the time. Some defendants faced the death penalty, while others received life imprisonment because they had been juveniles. These differences did not change the central finding of the case. All defendants had been convicted, and all were held legally responsible for their roles. The sentencing phase also reinforced the complexity of cases involving multiple offenders. When several people participate in the same crime, the justice system must evaluate both the collective nature of the offense and the individual circumstances of each participant. The existence of a group does not eliminate the need for individual judgment. Courts must determine responsibility and punishment according to evidence and legal standards. The case remains significant because of the contrast between the victims' ordinary circumstances and the severity of the crime committed against them. Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena were teenagers who had attended a party before beginning the walk home. Their lives were interrupted during an activity that, in most circumstances, would have been completely routine. The sentences imposed on the defendants reflected the seriousness of what occurred and the lasting consequences for the victims, families, and community. The legal outcome also represented the final stage of a process that had begun with uncertainty. When Jennifer and Elizabeth failed to return home, there were unanswered questions about what had happened. Investigators then worked to reconstruct events through evidence and witness statements. The defendants were identified, arrested, prosecuted, and convicted. Sentencing completed the legal response. From a historical perspective, The case demonstrates how criminal justice systems attempt to balance several responsibilities at once. They must recognize the harm suffered by victims, hold offenders accountable, and apply legal principles consistently. In this case, the different sentences reflected the system's effort to apply those principles while responding to one of Houston's most serious crimes. The sentences also became part of the lasting public memory of the case. Discussions about the crime often included not only the facts of what happened, but also the legal consequences faced by those convicted. The difference between death sentences and life imprisonment became a significant aspect of the case because it illustrated how legal considerations can produce different outcomes even among individuals convicted in connection with the same event. Over time, the case continued to be remembered because it involved several elements that had a profound impact on the community. The victims were young. The crime occurred after an ordinary social activity. Multiple offenders were involved. The investigation required the careful gathering of evidence. The trial resulted in convictions. The sentences reflected different legal considerations among the defendants. Each of these elements contributed to the case's place in Houston's criminal history. However, the importance of the case cannot be measured only by the severity of the punishments imposed. The central issue remains the lives of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena and the impact their deaths had on those who knew them. The legal system provided answers regarding responsibility, but the broader questions surrounding the case continued beyond sentencing. Communities often continue to examine major crimes long after court proceedings end because the consequences extend beyond the courtroom. Families continue to live with loss, and communities continue to remember the events that changed their understanding of safety and justice. The sentencing outcomes therefore represented both an ending and a continuation. They ended the formal legal proceedings by establishing the consequences faced by those convicted. At the same time, they marked the beginning of the case's place in public memory. The story moved from an active investigation and trial into the historical record, where it would continue to be discussed as one of Houston's most significant criminal cases. The case of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena ultimately demonstrated the full progression of a major criminal investigation. An ordinary evening led to a devastating crime. Investigators gathered evidence and identified those responsible. Prosecutors presented the case in court. Defendants were convicted. Sentences were imposed according to legal standards, with different outcomes based on factors including age at the time of the offense. The final legal outcome reflected the seriousness of the crime and the justice system's determination that those responsible should face consequences. Some received death sentences, while others received life imprisonment due to their juvenile status when the crime occurred. These sentences became the official conclusion of the court process, but they did not erase the significance of the victims' lives or the lasting impact of their loss. The story of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena remains a reminder that behind every criminal case are individuals, families, and communities affected by events that cannot be undone. The convictions and sentences provided legal accountability, but remembrance continues to focus on the two teenagers whose lives ended during a walk home after a party in Houston in 1993. The case of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena remains significant in Houston, not only because of the crime itself, but because of the lasting impact it had on the community and the way people understood issues of safety, violence, and justice. After the investigation, trial, convictions, and sentencing had concluded, the case moved from an active criminal proceeding into public memory. The legal questions had been answered, but the emotional and social consequences continued. The story had begun with two teenagers and a routine activity. Jennifer Ertman, 14 years old, and Elizabeth Pena, 16 years old, had attended a party before beginning the walk home. In most circumstances, such an evening would have been remembered only by the people who participated in it. It would have been another ordinary moment in the lives of two young people. Instead, the events that followed transformed that evening into one of the most remembered criminal cases in Houston's history. For the community, one of the most difficult aspects of the case was the contrast between the beginning of the evening and its outcome. The victims had not been involved in a situation that appeared extraordinary. They were teenagers spending time with friends and attempting to return home afterward. The fact that such an ordinary activity ended in tragedy contributed to the deep impact the case had on residents who followed the investigation. Communities often respond strongly to crimes that challenge basic assumptions about everyday life. People rely on routines because routines provide a sense of stability. Families expect young people to attend social gatherings, travel between familiar places, and return home safely. When those expectations are violated, the consequences extend beyond the immediate victims and their families. The broader community begins to reconsider questions about safety, responsibility, and how such events can occur. The case also demonstrated the importance of a complete investigative response. After Jennifer and Elizabeth were killed, those responsible attempted to conceal evidence. However, investigators were able to overcome those efforts through witness statements and supporting evidence. The eventual identification and conviction of all defendants showed the role that careful police work and evidence-based investigation play in achieving accountability. For law enforcement, the case represented the necessity of reconstructing events from available information. Investigations into serious crimes often require patience and precision. Authorities must separate confirmed facts from assumptions, determine reliable timelines, and connect evidence to individuals. In this case, investigators successfully transformed an unclear and tragic situation into a documented criminal case that could be presented in court. The importance of evidence remained one of the central lessons of the investigation. The offender's attempt to conceal the crime did not prevent the justice system from establishing the truth. Witness statements provided important information, while additional evidence strengthened the case. Together, these elements allowed investigators and prosecutors to demonstrate responsibility through legal procedures rather than relying on speculation. The impact of the case was also felt by those who knew Jennifer and Elizabeth personally. The loss of a young person affects families and communities in ways that extend far beyond the moment of the crime. While the legal system focused on evidence, charges, convictions, and sentences, the personal consequences continued long after the courtroom proceedings ended. The passage of time does not change the fundamental facts of the case. Jennifer and Elizabeth were teenagers whose lives ended after they were stopped by gang members while walking home. They were held against their will for several hours and killed. The offenders attempted to hide evidence, but investigators identified them, and all defendants were convicted. Some received death sentences, while others received life imprisonment because they had been juveniles when the crime occurred. The case also became part of wider discussions about criminal responsibility. Because multiple individuals were involved and some were minors at the time of the crime, the sentencing process reflected complex legal considerations. The different outcomes among defendants highlighted the challenge of applying justice in cases where the severity of the offense must be balanced with legally recognized differences among offenders. These discussions continued beyond the courtroom because major criminal cases often become part of larger conversations within society. Questions about punishment, juvenile offenders, and public safety frequently emerge after cases involving serious violence. The case of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena became one example of how communities examine the relationship between crime, accountability, and the justice system's response. However, the significance of the case should not be measured only through the actions of the offenders or the sentences imposed upon them. A complete understanding must also recognize the victims themselves. Jennifer and Elizabeth were not simply names connected to a criminal investigation. They were two teenagers whose lives existed before the crime and whose absence affected those around them. Remembering victims is an important part of understanding criminal history. Investigations and trials naturally focus on identifying offenders and determining legal responsibility, but the foundation of every case is the lives affected by the crime. In this case, the central human reality remained the loss of two young people who should have had the opportunity to continue growing, developing, and experiencing the future. The community response to the case also reflected the importance of justice being carried out through established procedures. Public attention surrounding serious crimes can create strong emotions, but the legal system must rely on evidence and standards that apply consistently. The investigation, prosecution, and convictions demonstrated how accountability is established through documented facts rather than public reaction alone. The case also showed how the consequences of crime extend across different institutions. Law enforcement agencies worked to identify those responsible. Prosecutors presented the evidence. Courts determined guilt and imposed sentences. families, and communities continued to remember the victims. Each group experienced the case differently, but all were connected by the same events that began with a walk home in 1993. Over the years, the case remained a reference point in discussions about crime in Houston. Its continued attention came from the combination of factors surrounding it: the ages of the victims, the circumstances of the crime, the involvement of multiple offenders, and the extensive legal process that followed. These elements made the case stand out within the city's criminal history. The lasting importance of the case also came from the reminder that criminal investigations are ultimately about people. Evidence, court records, and legal decisions are necessary parts of the process, but they exist because real individuals experienced harm. In the case of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena, the investigation and trial were responses to the loss of two teenagers whose lives were cut short. The legal outcome provided accountability, but it could not remove the tragedy itself. A conviction does not restore what was lost. A sentence does not reverse the events that occurred. Instead, the purpose of justice is to establish responsibility, recognize the harm caused, and provide a lawful response to criminal actions. The case, therefore, remains significant on two levels. On one level, it was a criminal investigation that demonstrated how evidence and witness statements could lead to convictions even when offenders attempted to conceal their actions. On another level, it was a human tragedy involving two teenagers and the families and community affected by their deaths. Looking back, the story of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena continues to represent the importance of remembering victims while understanding the role of justice. The investigation showed the value of persistence and evidence. The trial established legal responsibility. The sentences reflected the court's decisions regarding punishment. Yet beyond all of these stages remained the central fact that two young lives had been lost. Houston's memory of the case has therefore been shaped not only by the crime, but also by the response that followed. It became a reminder of the responsibilities carried by investigators, courts, and communities when confronted with violence. It demonstrated that even after a devastating event, the pursuit of truth and accountability remains essential. The case of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena continues to be remembered because it represents both a tragedy and a lesson in the importance of justice. Their story began with an ordinary evening and ended with a criminal investigation that affected an entire city. The legal process provided answers about responsibility, but the memory of the victims remains the most enduring part of the case. Their names continue to represent the human consequences of violence and the importance of preserving compassion and remembrance when examining the history of crime. The case of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena remains one of the most remembered criminal cases in Houston's history because it represents the intersection of several elements that continue to shape how communities understand violence, justice, and remembrance. It began with two teenagers attending a party and attempting to return home, an ordinary sequence of events that carried no indication of the tragedy that would follow. It ended with a major criminal investigation, multiple convictions, and sentences that reflected the seriousness of the crime, as well as the legal circumstances of those responsible. At the center of the case are two young people whose lives ended far too soon. Jennifer Ertman was 14 years old. Elizabeth Pena was 16 years old. Before they became known through a criminal investigation, they were simply teenagers living their lives in Houston during 1993. They attended a party, spent time with others, and began the walk home. Those facts remain important because they place the victims at the beginning of the story rather than defining them only by the crime committed against them. The tragedy of the case lies partly in the contrast between the ordinary nature of the evening and the events that followed. A social gathering and a walk home are experiences shared by countless young people. Families expect such moments to be safe and temporary parts of growing up. The events involving Jennifer and Elizabeth challenged that expectation and left a lasting impact on those who learned about their deaths. The investigation that followed demonstrated the importance of evidence and careful police work. After the girls were stopped by gang members while walking home, held against their will for several hours, and killed, the offenders attempted to conceal evidence. However, those efforts did not prevent investigators from determining what had happened. Through witness statements and supporting evidence, authorities were able to identify those responsible and bring the case into the legal system. This process highlights one of the central principles of criminal investigations: The truth is established through evidence. Serious crimes may initially involve uncertainty, incomplete information, and unanswered questions. Investigators must reconstruct events step by step, separating confirmed facts from assumptions. In this case, the investigation transformed an unclear and devastating situation into a documented account that could be examined by the courts. The trial and convictions that followed represented the formal response of the justice system. The court examined the evidence and determined that all defendants were responsible. The outcome demonstrated that the investigation had successfully established the connection between the offenders and the crime. Through the legal process, responsibility was assigned according to the evidence presented. The sentencing phase revealed another important aspect of the case. Although all defendants were convicted, their punishments differed. Some received death sentences, while others received life imprisonment because they had been juveniles at the time of the crime. This distinction reflected the legal consideration of age and the different standards applied to individuals who were minors when serious offenses were committed. The different sentences became part of the historical discussion surrounding the case because they demonstrated the complexity of criminal justice. The legal system must consider multiple factors when determining punishment. It must recognize the severity of the crime while also applying legal principles that distinguish between individuals based on circumstances such as age. In the case of Jennifer and Elizabeth, these considerations resulted in different penalties while maintaining the same conclusion of guilt. The conclusion of the legal proceedings did not erase the impact of the crime. For the families of Jennifer and Elizabeth, the loss remained permanent. The justice system could provide accountability, but it could not restore the future that had been taken away. This distinction is important when examining criminal cases historically. Court decisions may resolve legal questions, but they cannot remove the human consequences of violence. The community of Houston also carried the memory of the case. The circumstances surrounding the crime affected public understanding of safety and responsibility. The fact that the victims were teenagers and that the crime followed an ordinary activity contributed to the lasting attention given to the case. It became a reminder that behind every criminal investigation are individuals, families, and communities whose lives are changed forever. The case also demonstrated the importance of remembering victims beyond the details of the crime. Criminal investigations naturally focus on offenders, evidence, and legal outcomes. However, the victims should remain central to any historical understanding. Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena were not defined by the circumstances of their deaths. They were two teenagers whose lives existed before the crime and whose absence affected those who knew them. Over time, the case became part of broader conversations about violence, gangs, juvenile offenders, and criminal responsibility. These discussions reflected the difficult questions that arise when serious crimes involve multiple people, including individuals who were young at the time of the offense. The case became an example of how legal systems attempt to balance accountability with the recognition of different circumstances among defendants. At the same time, the fundamental facts of the case remained unchanged. Jennifer and Elizabeth were walking home after attending a party when they encountered a group of gang members. They were held against their will for several hours and killed. The offenders attempted to conceal evidence, but investigators identified them through witness statements and supporting evidence. All defendants were convicted, and sentencing decisions were made according to the law. The lasting significance of the case comes from the connection between these facts and the broader lessons that followed. It demonstrated the value of thorough investigation, the importance of evidence, and the role of courts in determining responsibility. It also showed the lasting consequences of violent crime for victims, families, and communities. From a historical perspective, the case represents the complete journey of a criminal investigation. It began with uncertainty after two teenagers failed to return home. It progressed through the collection of evidence, identification of suspects, arrests, prosecution, and trial. It ended with convictions and sentences, but the memory of the victims continued beyond the legal process. The story of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena is therefore not only a story about a crime. It is also a story about the response that followed. Investigators worked to uncover the truth. Prosecutors presented the evidence. Courts established accountability. Families and communities continued to remember the victims. Each part of this process contributed to the historical significance of the case. The passage of time has not reduced the importance of understanding what happened. True crime cases are often examined because they reveal how justice systems respond to extraordinary events. However, the most important element remains the human impact behind the investigation. Jennifer and Elizabeth were teenagers whose lives should have continued beyond that evening in 1993. Their story serves as a reminder that criminal cases involve more than evidence and court decisions. They involve people, relationships, and futures that are permanently changed. While the legal system addressed the responsibility of those convicted, remembrance continues to focus on the victims and the importance of acknowledging their lives. The case of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena remains part of Houston's history because it represents both tragedy and accountability. It shows how a routine evening can become the subject of a major investigation and how evidence can lead to justice even when offenders attempt to hide their actions. It also demonstrates that the impact of a crime extends far beyond the courtroom. Ultimately, the most enduring legacy of the case is the importance of remembering Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena as individuals. Their names should not exist only within legal records or discussions of criminal history. They represent two young lives that were lost, two families affected by unimaginable grief, and a community that continues to recognize the importance of justice and remembrance. The investigation answered the question of who was responsible. The courts established legal consequences. The sentences reflected the decisions of the justice system. But the memory of Jennifer and Elizabeth remains the central truth of the case. Two teenagers left a party intending only to return home, and their lives were taken in an act of violence that would leave a lasting mark on Houston and on everyone connected to their story.